Good afternoon. I think we're going to begin the second session today. My name is Ed Marchak. I am a management consultant here in Edmonton, and I've done work with ACDS, and I was asked to come and speak today about what I understand are some changes that are currently being made by Alberta Human Services as it relates to the procurement process for services within the PDD system. What I have put together is a brief slideshow, and I'm new to this technology, so my understanding is you can hear me, but you're seeing my slides if you are not in the room. So if there are questions, I'll be taking questions from the floor here. I'm not sure I can take questions from those who are live streaming. But what I wanted to do is provide a bit of an overview based on my understanding of what PDD is planning to do. And it's also sprinkled with my experience as having been a consultant working with the Government of Alberta's procurement process for over 25 years on some of the things that you might expect and anticipate going forward as the procurement process rolls out. And I understand even as recently as 2 weeks ago there have been some changes as to when the new PQR process is going to be rolled out. So this is real time. I updated my presentation this morning to try and account for some of the most recent changes that have been made. So we're now trying to move my slides forward for those of you that are watching this in live stream. Really only have four topics that I'm going to go through today. The first is really, what do I hope that I can share with you? What is the purpose of the session, as it was described to me when I was asked to present today? Talk a little bit about some of the background that's led up to the changes in the procurement process. Talk about the Government of Alberta's procurement process, again based on my experience with it and what I understand the changes are that are being proposed. And then really allow time at the end to answer any questions you may have based on what is coming. I will qualify all of this by saying I do not know what Human Services plans are. I do know how the procurement process typically works, and I can offer some perspective on what I think the changes might be leading to, but I do not have in any way, shape, or form any knowledge as to what Human Services is planning to do over the next 6 months as the new PQR process is rolled out. The purpose today, provide an overview of the Government of Alberta's procurement process. So what is the process that you will likely need to follow, and what are some of the content that you will need to be aware of as you look at completing responses to the PQRs and ultimately down the road the RFPs. The use of acronyms is famous in the Government of Alberta. Pre-qualification or pre-qualified resource, pre-qualified resource list, so there's the PQR list, and then the RFP is the request for proposals, which will come after. One of the other things I thought I could do and share is provide some tips as to what you might want to watch for when these documents come out, because again they are rather restrictive in terms of the expectations that they have, and I will share with you some of the lessons I've learned in having responded to RFPs over the years and some of the things that can trip you up, so that hopefully you'll avoid those as you go forward in responding to these types of things. So what is the Government of Alberta proposing? Well, this is based on a couple conversations I've had with Aaron Waite and some background information that's been shared with me as it relates to the new procurement process that is being proposed by Human Services. So right now, Human Services is looking at, in 2016, putting out a number of different pre-qualified requests for services that will be preparing pre-qualified lists of service providers that can provide certain services within the province. There are four categories that they are looking at putting PQRs out for. These include services to individuals with disabilities, child and family services, transportation services, and specialized assessments and consultation with health professionals. Each of these PQRs will have then additional services within each of them, and literally as we speak there are information sessions being held around the province which are trying to provide more information about this proposed PQR process. Preliminary feedback I've received is that there's still confusion and quite frankly concern about how these new processes will contribute to a better quality of life for people with developmental disabilities. And this is information that Aaron has shared with me as to some of the concerns they've expressed based on them having sat through one of the information sessions and the information that was shared with them. My understanding is the sessions in Edmonton are either this week or next week. And so some of the information you're seeing here is similar to what you will receive at these other information sessions. So how will it work? Well, I've tried to create a very simplified model of how the procurement process will likely work. I cannot say with certainty that this is how it will work, but I have enough experience with the government's procurement process to suggest that there are certain steps along the way that will be taken, and these are the ones that you really need to be aware of so that you're prepared for when these PQRs come out, how to best respond to them. It's really a two-step process. Step one is preparing the list of pre-qualified resources. So there will be a PQR request that goes out, and you will be asked to respond to certain services that your organizations feel you are capable to provide services in. There will be a minimum set of standards set, and then you will be on a PQR list. The second step of the process is what's called an RFP process, a request for proposals. So from that pre-qualified list, a request for proposals will go out and you will be asked to respond. And I'll go into a little more detail how I have experienced the RFP process and what the likely outcome is. Again, with the qualification that I cannot guarantee that this is how the future one will work, but it will likely be very consistent with what the Government of Alberta has done previously. It starts with the identification of the need by the Government of Alberta. So the slide that I have on the screen now shows really three different streams. There's the Government of Alberta through Human Services will identify the need, and they've identified needs in these four different areas. Those needs will then be turned into a set of requirements which will then form the basis of these four PQRs. And each of the PQRs has, with the exception of transportation services, a number of different services, up to 15 different services within each of them that fall under each of these PQRs. The PQRs will be posted on the Government of Alberta's online vendor bidding tool called the Alberta Purchasing Connection. And this is the online tool that all organizations, municipal, school boards, municipalities can put out RFPs or RFQs, which are requests for quotations, RFPs, to solicit input from the vendor community to respond to these particular things. APC is publicly available. APC is open to vendors across Canada, and through the TILMA agreement, which basically is an agreement signed between the Western Canadian provinces, there cannot be any biases against organizations outside the province of Alberta. So theoretically, anything that's posted on APC can be responded to by organizations from anywhere in Canada. Once the PQR is downloaded, so every service provider that is interested in providing these services going forward must register online to the Alberta Purchasing Connection, and these information sessions will explain how to do that. You can also learn to do that online. You set up a vendor identification, and then you will be able to download electronic copies of these pre-qualification resource requirements. they will have within them, and I'll go into the content that are likely going to be in these, there will be some very specific instructions that you must conform to, and very specific services that you must identify whether you are interested in responding to. There will be very well-defined dates that you must submit your response to. Those go back to Human Services, who will then evaluate the responses against the predefined minimum requirements. And if you meet those requirements, you will then be put on this PQR list. And from that point, be eligible to respond to RFPs that may come out sometime in the future. The RFP process is very similar with one exception. And again, this is my understanding of how it will work. Once you are on a pre-qualification resource list, a set of requirements will be put together, and depending upon which list you are on and or which services you have been pre-qualified for, you will be eligible to receive an RFP. The RFP will go into more explicit detail about the specific service requirements, the region, the types of services that the government is looking for. And my understanding is, rather than those being posted on the Alberta Purchasing Connection, they are then directly shipped to or made available to organizations that have been pre-qualified. You will then have a window of time within which to respond to those RFPs. Those RFPs will then be sent back to Human Services for review, at which point they will be evaluated against a set of predetermined criteria, and a successful vendor will be identified to deliver the services as defined in the RFP. So that is the typical Government of Alberta procurement process. The 4 PQRs that will be issued, and I saw a communique that said these would have, up until the 6-month deferral, there was going to be a 1-month window within which these PQRs were going to be issued and had to be responded by. And within that 1-month window, you would have had to identify which of the, first and foremost, which PQR would you be responding to, and which services within each PQR would you be responding to. The information sessions, and I do have a copy of the material that Erin sent to me because she attended the one in Calgary. The information or the services required for each of the PQRs, I do have copies here for those that are here. Otherwise, I would strongly suggest you go to the information sessions to see what are the services that will be covered by each of the PQRs. As it's been defined, there will be within the documents a set of minimum requirements that you must be able to meet to be pre-qualified. I do not know whether they will have to do with certain credentials that you must demonstrate, certain years of experience that you must have, certain levels of staff. I really don't know. RFQs, or requests for quotation, that I have responded to in my business, they typically relate to demonstrated experience and number of years of experience in a certain service area. So comparing that to the types of services that you provide, I expect that they must be able to demonstrate a certain level of competency in certain areas that you want to be considered for going forward. The first thing you must decide is whether you will respond to one or more PQR and or one or more services within each PQR. So conceivably, if your organization wants to respond to all 4 PQRs, there are probably over 35 different services that you would have to be able to demonstrate competency in to meet the minimum requirements. So my first tip is really start thinking now about what services and or which PQR you feel particularly qualified to take on. Get that list get that list now, get that list early, and start pulling together your credentials as soon as possible. The RFQs that I have responded to over the years are incredibly or can be incredibly onerous because of the level of detail they may require for you to put down. I have no knowledge of what will be in these PQRs. I'm speaking based on the types of responses that I've had to put forward in my years as a consultant. Okay. Some of the elements, and these are based on my experience with requests for quotations that the government of Alberta has issued, and in particular the Department of Human Services has issued. So these are fairly common to any request for qualification that comes out of government. The first thing you must realize with these things is there are mandatory requirements that if you do not meet any of them, you will be deemed ineligible and be precluded from any further evaluation. The first and most important one is the due date. If it says 2 p.m. on a certain day, if you're there at 2:01, they will not accept your responses. Some of them will say they need to be hand delivered. Some will say electronic submissions are fine. Read through all of the requirements to make sure you understand when it's due, what time it's due, where it must be delivered to, and allow adequate time, if you're not in the same city, to make sure that you get it there before the closing date and time. Because once that date and time passes, you will not be able to get the document. Now, in this room, and I don't know if the people who are watching this live stream, I'm seeing people taking frantic notes, so what I am going to say is these slides will absolutely be made available to anyone and everyone who wants them. I had assumed that they would be made available, so please, if you want copies of this, let Jamie know or Aaron or someone else know, and we'll make sure that we get copies of all of these slides to everyone who wants them. The second thing that you will see in pretty well every RFP, RFQ, anything that's there is a list of definitions. And these definitions are important insofar as they explain certain rules of engagement, if you will. You will see one that says the words must, shall, will, mandatory all imply that if you do not meet something that has or follows the word must, you will be deemed non-compliant and will be excluded from any further evaluation. So the definitions are important insofar as they provide clarification about what are some of the things that you will see in the rest of the document. The introduction will describe the purpose of the PQR. So the purpose of PQR number 1 is to solicit responses to those that can provide transportation services either locally, regionally, provincially, whatever. So it will provide you with some background context for which particular PQR and what are the services they're looking for. The requirements section is the one to pay particular attention to. They may have both a set of mandatory requirements and or desirable requirements. Mandatory requirements, if you cannot meet, you will not get past the evaluation process. So if it says must be able to demonstrate 5 years of experience in service area ABC, then you have two options. You either demonstrate capability in that area, or potentially you look to team with another organization that may have those capabilities, and they may allow, and this is where each PQR, each RFQ is different, they may allow for consortia bids or where you bid with another organization. Desirable requirements may be other things that, although they may not preclude you from being on the PQR list, they may be important when you get to the RFP stage. So they may say, and please demonstrate any other credentials your staff might have or your organization may have. It is not a mandatory requirement, but it may be something that is important as you get into the RFP process.
they will not likely be evaluated. So PQRs and or RFQs have a minimum set of requirements that you must meet. If you meet it, you're on the list. Response guidelines. Pay careful attention to this. If it says 3 copies, a hard copy and an electronic copy, include 3 copies, a hard copy, and a bound copy and an electronic copy. Some that I've responded to have said must be 11-point font, 1-inch margins, literally at that level of detail. Pay attention to those things. When they say they must be bound in such a way that they lay flat when opened, it means you don't staple them in the corner, you must put them in 3-ring binders and so on. When they say they must be hand delivered or cannot be couriered, they can be electronic or they aren't allowed to be electronic. Pay careful attention to that. I've had experiences where I had a PQR that said all resources must be named, and I put in all resources except my EA who was going to do my photocopying, and I didn't put her name in the response, and I was deemed non-compliant, and I was precluded from further evaluation. So when they say must, and it says all requirements must, all of the following requirements must be met, make sure you follow all those requirements. Some may include a section on the response evaluation. The responses will be evaluated in the following way. First thing they do is make sure it was delivered on time. They will make sure it has been signed by an authorized representative from the organization, and they will make sure that it has all the sections that they said they must be there. That's step 1. Then they go through and say, now for each of the sections, does this organization, have they been able to demonstrate that they meet the minimum mandatory requirements as identified in the PQR. It will also say here's the timelines within which we may evaluate. They may say here is the process by which we will post the names of pre-qualified resources or not. But the response guidelines really tell you what you need to do to put forth a compliant bid, who to send questions to if you have questions about the response, and what you need to do to make sure you're getting the information in a timely manner. There is very often a section called Administrative Terms and Conditions. This lists everything from we will not pay for the cost of you preparing your response. All costs are incurred by you as the organization. You must maintain confidentiality. All information is protected by FOIP, etc., etc., etc. Standard boilerplate governmentese that says these are the things you must comply with. My one tip here, this is based on personal experience. The minute you download your electronic copy of this document, go through and highlight the word must, mandatory, shall, will, required with a highlighter. Because at that point you can go back and very quickly make sure you've not missed anything. And that's the one thing that you want to make sure you do, is not be excluded on the basis of a technicality, on the basis of having missed something that was just an oversight. The most important thing I can tell you about the PQR is to get on that list. You cannot provide services if you don't get on the list. You cannot respond to an RFP if you're not on the list. It's all about getting on the list. So this is where it's not about lots of fluff and lots of nice pictures and lots of whatever. It's about making sure you meet the minimum. Meet the minimum requirements, because given the time frames that I saw, 1 month, and given the number of particular service areas that you needed to demonstrate capability in if you chose to go after more than 1 or 2, you will need to spend a significant amount of time putting together the response to meet the minimum mandatory requirements. So first and foremost, make sure your response is delivered in the appropriate format before the closing time on the closing date. That's step 1. Okay? If it's not there on time, it will not get evaluated. Very often they will include cover sheets. And these cover sheets typically say, we, the undersigned, agree to the terms and conditions as identified in the RFQ and signed by authorized representative of the company. make sure it is signed. I've seen RFPs or RFQs go in and they forgot to put the signature on, and that is cause for elimination from the PQR process. So make sure that if you're putting it in, if they ask for it, if they have a cover sheet included in one of the appendices, copy it, use it, because it has the words that they want to see. Use them if they ask you to use them. If you claim you have certain experience, back it up. You may be asked to provide clarification. There are RFQ processes, and again, I'm assuming the PQR process may be the same. Once submitted, there is not an opportunity to add additional information. So what they see is what they've got to make their decision on. And if you claim 10 years of experience and they ask for 5, but there is no evidence to support that you have 10 years of experience, they may say insufficient information to verify that you have the required minimum requirement. So this is where I stress, it's not about writing nice paragraphs, it's about documenting what you do. Bullet point. We've got 10 years of experience, 3 years here, 2 years here, 2 years here, 1 year here, 3 years here. Dates, if you've got them. So from 1999 to 2001 we did this, from 2003 to 2005 we did that. This is the information we have. They may or may not ask for references. Again, I don't know the details. Often as part of the pre-qualification process, you have to provide corporate references, organizations and or individuals that you've worked with that can attest to the work you've done. If they ask for it, provide it. The response guidelines, if for whatever reason you do not understand what they're asking for, find the name of the individual that they will likely name as the contact person for questions and send in your question. Do not assume. Do not assume that you know what they're asking for. If in any way, shape, or form you do not understand what's being asked for, ask for clarification. Better to ask 12 questions and be absolutely sure you've got it right than make an assumption and make the wrong assumption and be precluded from further evaluation. Okay. Bottom line, you can't respond to an RFP if you're not on the PQR list. Job one is to get on the list. We have a question?
Most of the RFPs that I've responded to have an information day. Is that a process for a PQR as well, or are they going to do that only for the RFPs, or what does that look like?
The short answer is I don't know. I can only speak from personal experience and say in the last year I have responded to probably 12 RFPs and not one of them has had an information day. There seems to be a shift, and one of the documents, there was a communique that came out that talked about the new procurement guidelines that have come out. You cannot sole source projects over $10,000. Anything over $10,000 now must go to a formal procurement process. My assumption, and that's all it is, the administrative work that is now being put on the staff to put together these RFPs has gone up because of the number that they have to put out, because nothing over $10,000 can be sole source or directed. More time is being spent on the administrative efforts to get the RFPs out and back in. That things, the nice to haves like a question and answer session for vendors, have been reduced. So whether they will or not, I don't know. I would absolutely, when a PQR comes out, look to see if there is an information session. If it's there, get it on your calendar the first thing. So in addition to highlighting the musts and the mandatories, highlight when that information session is being held. If it's not being held, immediately send a question back to the procurement person and say, is there going to be an information session for all vendors to ask their questions? Because every question that is asked, someone must research that question, put together an answer for the question, and send the question out to all vendors who have downloaded that particular PQR RFP off the website. So there's a lot of work on the the side of the procurement people to simply keep up with the administration that must go into the procurement process, that they may simply not have the time for a formal Q&A session. But look for it. If there is one, it will likely be within the document, and then get that on your calendars and go to those sessions. Okay. Your response. This is now 3-6 months later. So let's assume you have now been successful in being pre-qualified for a particular service in one or more of the PQRs. You are now eligible to receive RFPs. I stress this second point because I do not know how Human Services plans to do this. I know of examples within the Government of Alberta where once you are on a pre-qualified list, that does not necessarily mean you get invited to respond to all RFPs. So depending upon how it is done, there have been, and this preceded the new procurement guidelines, so I don't know what the intent is going forward, there could be requests to 3 of the pre-qualified vendors for a particular RFP. There may be specific requirements that they may go through and say, based on our review of the PQR responses, there is only one vendor who has these skills in this region with this credential. They do have the right to sole source and say, we will direct this piece of business to the one vendor that has and meets all of these requirements. I would ask the question, if you're on the PQR list, does that automatically guarantee that you will get an RFP for the services that you have been pre-qualified for, or at the discretion of the government, can they go to a subset of the pre-qualified service providers and only ask for responses from them? I have experienced that. I am on 2 pre-qualified lists, and I have never been asked to respond to an RFP, and that's over 2 years. That simply means either that there have not been RFPs let, or that I did not meet one of the requirements for a particular piece of work, or they are able to only go to 3 vendors, and so I was not one of the 3 vendors that they chose to send the RFP to. So based on my experience, I would suggest that you ask, once I get on the PQR list, does that assure me that I will get RFPs for which I have been pre-qualified for? I'll leave it at that. RFPs will likely now require more information. Again, I am only speaking based on my experience providing consulting services. I do not know how Human Services will do it with the types of services they are asking. But the things you will see, you will now be expected, because the RFPs become the basis upon which contracts will be written. So there is likely going to be requests for cost and or work effort to deliver a certain services over a certain window of time. There will now likely be an expectation around skills and experiences of individuals within your organization. So if you as an organization claim that you can deliver this service, demonstrate that you have the resources that can deliver these services. So there is potentially the need to start identifying and or naming people. And finally, you may be asked to provide not only additional organizational references, but potentially personal references for the individuals. Again, if there is a skill where it's an assessment service and you need to identify who is going to do the assessment, you may need to say it's this person, they have these credentials, they've been doing assessments for 15 years, these are the organizations that they have done assessments for, these are the contact people at these organizations that you can contact to confirm that that person has in fact done that. RFPs are even more onerous to complete if you have not done work in advance to start thinking about these questions. So I think part of the reason that Aaron suggested that this might be worthwhile is it gives you an opportunity to start thinking ahead. First and foremost, think about those services that you believe you're qualified to deliver, and start putting together your lists of credentials, your references, and other things that may help you in preparing these once these PQRs have been released and ultimately the RFPs have been released. One of the things that I have learned, and this is based on personal experience over the last year since the procurement guidelines have changed within the government of Alberta. I have 30 years of consulting experience. I have been unsuccessful in the last 12 government RFPs I've put in, because now more than ever there is a requirement to demonstrate expertise in every aspect that they ask for. And so I may be an expert in this area, very good in this area, and have some experience in this area, but the organizations that are now being successful can demonstrate expertise in all three. So one of the things that I personally am starting to do is look for partnering opportunities, teaming opportunities, subcontracting opportunities. So if and when an RFP comes out that you have been pre-qualified for, and you met the minimum requirements, but now there are some desirable requirements that they're asking for that you may not be able to meet on your own, consider partnering with other organizations that are on that PQR list. RFPs, as a rule, are intended to select one successful vendor. So there may be 15 organizations that are on the PQR list, all of whom have met the minimum requirements. RFPs are intended to select one vendor. If, however, you can partner and or team with 2 or 3 other organizations under one umbrella, you may in fact be able to present a stronger case than a single organization can on their own. That's based on my experience, and again, I'm only offering this as something to think about. I do not know what these RFPs may look like, but I do know that the RFP process, as a rule, is about picking one organization to deliver that particular piece of service for that particular window of time. Okay, so that's one other piece of information I would share. So, assuming that the PQR process goes ahead as planned, because I know there are still conversations going on about the PQR process and is this the right thing to do and how is it going to unfold, until you hear otherwise. Going forward, based on what has been stated, you cannot help your clients if you are not selected to deliver the service for them. You cannot be selected if you are not pre-qualified. And you cannot be pre-qualified if you don't respond to the PQRs and meet those minimum requirements. So the message here is, if this is the way, and all indications are this is the way that human services is going, then be prepared. Do not wait for the PQR to come out before you start putting your material together. Do not wait for the RFP to come out before looking at where are the areas that we may not be as strong in. And are there opportunities to work with some other organizations to put a really, really strong proposal together? All of that may be moot depending upon what is explicitly written in these PQRs. I can only speak to the experience I've had in working with Government of Alberta, RFQs, RFPs, for the better part of 25 years, and I've seen all kinds of different things. But I can tell you definitively that all indications are that this is about fine-tuning a process to establish a minimum set of requirements and then selecting qualified vendors to deliver sets of services that the government deems need to be delivered in a certain way. And with that, I will open up the floor. Until the process is changed or no longer used, do everything you can to put your best foot forward. Okay? I will now open up the floor here for questions to see if anybody within the room has questions. I'm assuming I can't get questions from out in cyberspace.
We've actually got a few queued up here.
Oh, well, excellent. So Jamie has a few questions that he will read off to me that I will endeavor to answer. So, Jamie.
Success is dependent on administrative processing of RFP as it is on qualifications.
Yes and yes. I hate to say this, qualifications are secondary to administration in the PQR process. The PQR process, first and foremost, is looking for compliance. Can you follow the rules as defined? The PQR process will then say qualifications, are they at a certain level? My experience is at the PQR level, it is similar to a pass-fail mark. It's not you get a 90% or an 80% and you're that much better. You're either on the list or you're not. It's pass-fail, you met the mandatory requirements or not. At the RFP process, absolutely qualifications depend, or the better the qualifications are, the better you will score. Here's the other part that I didn't put in this. As part of the RFP process, as I now understand it, and I've talked to some of the procurement folks around the process, when the RFP is put together, the criteria, the scoring, and the weighting that you will be evaluated against are prepared at the exact same time. So often the RFPs will say, we will give 30% of the total score to corporate credentials, 20% to cost, 50% or 40% to qualifications of the individuals, and 10% to value add. Pay attention to those percentages because that should give you an indication of where you put your efforts in the responses you put together. So at the PQR process, I would say it's more about the administration and you get the passing grade. At the RFP process, it's more about the quality and the credentials and the qualifications, so long as you still meet the administrative requirements. Other questions? Okay, Jamie, go ahead. And then we'll...
Does it seem like tight timing to have PQR list published in March, then have RFP to respond ahead of the July 1st contract date?
Yes. However, I don't set the rules. One of the things that can happen, and it is not uncommon, if enough of the vendor community, so those that are being asked to respond, ask for extensions to due dates, they can be extended. The PQR process, immediately followed by an RFP process, says to me that they already have an idea of what services they are looking to get, and so very quickly after they get their list of qualified service providers, you may see RFPs coming out fairly quickly, all with the intent of, and as I understand it, it's now been delayed 6 months, but contracts have been extended, so my understanding is that they're going to want to get new service providers and or existing service providers with new contracts for certain things in place within the next, or shortly after that 6-month window is done. You had a question?
Does it cost to get on the Alberta Purchasing Connection?
There's no cost to get on to APC. You need a password, you need a user ID, anybody can go in and sign up for it. The instructions are actually very straightforward. I will say that APC is actually very easy. Once you're in there, if you don't know the particular PQR, you can type in a keyword like human services and you'll see human services. APC lists procurement for goods and services, so make sure you click on services because we're not looking at new graders. And then within services you can actually go in and put in a keyword and it will likely bring up certain things. You can also put in, and it was posted within the last week or it's going to close within the next month. I fully expect Human Services is going to give you lots of leeway and information and lead up to say, watch for it, it will be posted on this date, because they do know that this is, for many of you, the first time you'll be using APC. And that's where I say, ask lots of questions. If you can't find it, send an email to your contact or someone else and we'll find it for you. Other questions? Jamie?
Will the PQR process be open at various times throughout the year, or is this a one-time shot?
I don't know. I have, again, based on my experience, seen an RFQ that I responded to that was opened in 2013 and is closing in 2016, and you can respond to that at any point during that window. So if your credentials, so if I have 3 new projects and I want to update my credentials that they have on file, I can resubmit. That is an RFQ that I am familiar from one government department where they leave it open for a very long window of time, within which you can have other organizations be added to that pre-qualification list. My assumption would be that that would make sense, so that there will be, you know, a window and or could be other windows, but an RFP does have a very finite window. So if you're not on the first PQR list, you will not get that first RFP. If another RFP comes out 12 months later, there is likely going to be a window to get your name on the PQR list between the first RFP and the second. So I anticipate that there will be additional opportunities to get on the PQR list. But if you're not on the PQR list when the RFP is issued, you will not be eligible to receive that RFP, because it appears that the RFPs will not be posted on APC, but will be directed to those that are on the list. That's, again, based on my experience. I cannot speak definitively about how Human Services plans to do. Okay? Other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Will this process remove the decision-making on who gets what contract from the local regions to a provincial decision-making body?
Again, I don't know. The process as defined puts the decision-making in the hands of the evaluation team, committee, whatever you want to call them. I have participated in RFPs where those evaluation committees are comprised of both ministry officials as well as the not-for-profits for whom the service will be provided, so that those organizations have a say in who they believe has the best credentials going forward. So I can only speculate and say, because it is going through APC, because Human Services will be putting the RFPs out there, they are the ones who are defining the requirements, and as my one diagram showed, the responses go back to Human Services, and then the decision is made by Human Services and whoever they have brought in to participate in the evaluation of those responses. Any others? Or go ahead.
So, I'm a little confused, because let's say just on a specific, so like if you have clients through, currently through memorandum of MOAs,
Yeah.
right? And there are many vendors that are servicing those types of clients with PDD. So when you say
issues that need to be worked out, and maybe why there's been this 6-month delay in putting the PQRs out, as they start to think through the implications of a formal RFP process with the goal of selecting one priority vendor, and what does that do for, and how do we possibly transition from 30 service providers to 1? So the short answer is there are issues that need to be resolved. Human Services, I am guessing, is looking at how to manage the transition from the way things are currently being done to the way things are planned to be done. And there is a significant amount of work that needs to be done to make sure that as and when this happens, it happens in a way that does not impact the persons with developmental disabilities. Because at the end of the day, they are the individuals that we are there to support, and Human Services is there to support. The last thing anyone wants is to make things worse. But an administrative process that has that significant, or has the potential for that significant a change, will cause disruption. The best way to avoid that is to be very focused on managing the transition so that it is not disruptive. So it's a valid question, one that I do not know the answer to. I can only suggest that these are the questions that folks like Aaron are escalating to say, you know, be careful what we wish for, because we do not want the unintended consequences of hurting the individuals that we collectively are all there to serve and protect and to support.
So
Another
just
question.
one add-on question to that. Is there anything in the RFP process that would prevent the government from having several vendors? You know, like, is there anything in the process that stops them from saying, okay, yes, 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 like from taking more than one vendor?
Absolutely nothing. The
Right,
government,
so they
the
could.
procurement process can be defined pretty much any way they want it to be. So if they say, and this is again where the PQR list comes into play. If they look at the PQR list and say, we have in a particular region, the largest organization only has 10 staff, and there's no way any one organization could possibly deliver the services for that entire region, they may come out with an RFP that says we want to pick the top 5 organizations. So again, this is where the process is now being thought through to say, how do we make it seamless? How do we make it so that we don't disrupt the system while we try to move to a process that allows for consistency in the types of services we're asking for? But absolutely, they can say we want a consortium, they can say we want the top 5, we can say we only want one, they can say we completely missed the boat and we got no qualified responses. We need to break this RFP into smaller parts and reissue it. That has happened before as well, where there have been RFPs that have been so restrictive that they literally get no compliant bids. So and this was, I think, many, many years ago, I don't know the department, where they literally will say, nobody met the mandatories, we will reissue a revised RFP and we will change some of the mandatories to desirables, and we will actually break this very large request that we thought we were going to get one superhuman company to do into component parts. Those are also things to look for, to keep in mind, to consider as you look to help the transition. I mean, again, until it's not going to happen, we have to assume it is going to happen. So one of the things that I always stress, always, always, always keep at the forefront of your mind, it's about the people we're there to support. And if the RFP process has, as an unintended consequences, put something in place that could hurt them, the suggestion may be consider the top 3 vendors. And then the top 3 vendors, in coordination with the government, will decide how to best support the region or to deliver this service or whatever. So there's the ideal, and then there's what makes sense. And I think that's where there's a lot of work being done to try and think, how do we make this process work for everybody so that it doesn't, at the end of the day, harm the people we're there to support. Another question?
Just a comment and a question.
Yep.
My experience with RFPs, they pretty well say we can reject or accept any at
Yes.
our discretion.
Yep.
So it gets them off the hook. Well, my question is, under the human service banner,
Yep.
across the province, the provincial government is actually delivering services.
Mhm.
And they deliver services on the ground to people with developmental disabilities through companies throughout the province. There's graduated supports in Calgary, residential support services in Edmonton, and,
Yep.
and various other ones around the province. Do they have to bid on their own contracts?
I don't believe so.
So they're sole sourced?
I believe so. And again, I don't know the specifics. So AHS delivers health services for Alberta Health. They are the only organization that is, arm's length, and so they don't tender. We need another organization to bid against Alberta Health Services to deliver health in the province of Alberta. Okay, those examples I cannot specifically speak to, but one of the things I can say is government proper does deliver certain services, and government does also use third parties to deliver other services. I cannot recall within the window of time that I've worked for government where they've ever put a government agency, require them to bid for a particular service against the private sector or the not-for-profit sector. If the service is part of this, then the service is part of this ministry. I have seen services spun off where you say, we are now doing this service, we are no longer in that business, we're going to set up a Part 9 corporation, or we're going to set up another organization to deliver it, and they are then spun off as a separate not-for-profit. But I cannot speak to whether in that particular circumstance these organizations are required to compete for the right to deliver those services. I doubt that that's what this is about. I believe, and again, the document identifies those 4 areas, and within that you can go through and see the list of all the services that are being considered as part of PQR1, PQR2 for which services. My understanding is those are all services that are currently delivered by organizations like yours, and they are third-party delivered services. Question?
Okay, 2 things. So first, it's kind of similar to what she was saying. So through this process, it is possible that some service providers that currently provide services will no longer be providing services.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Secondly, how does this affect the individual or family choice when they want to be included in choosing an agency? They will no longer have that option. Is that correct?
I cannot answer that. I can only say if the procurement process follows exactly the procurement process that is in place for other types of services, that would in fact be the case. And I think that's where the effort is being made by organizations like the group that Aaron represents to say, this is not about hiring a paving company or someone to build a school. This is about making sure that for that family there is choice. If that choice is taken away by virtue of the government deciding which entity is the best based on some predetermined set of criteria, have we in fact reduced the ability and or the options that that family has for their specific situation? And I know those conversations are taking place. I don't know that they have been resolved. And this is where there may be an RFP that goes out that says, we will select 5, each of which is in a region, so that we still allow for choice, but rather than a choice of 100 different options, you now have a choice of 4 or 5. I don't know. I can only suggest that these issues are being thought through right now by people who are far more familiar with how services are delivered than I am. And these questions are being asked. And I think the government is taking the time to now make sure that they are looking at what are the potential unintended consequences of swinging the pendulum too hard to a pure procurement model, which may limit the options that families have available to them. But I cannot speak from a point of knowledge. I can only speak from what I do know, which is the traditional procurement process and the little bit of information that that Erin shared with me that is public domain. I mean, it just happens that the Calgary PQR presentation happened last week, and she sent me the slides saying this is what Human Services is doing in each of these regions over the next 2 weeks. So this is what they're saying, and this is how the PQR and RFP process will likely work. Jamie, any other questions there?
Yeah, we've got a couple. If an organization is not successful and loses their contract, what happens regarding all the attendant costs of winding things up?
Again, I do not know. I believe that these are questions that are more appropriately directed to Human Services. And again, so that Human Services can think about the transition costs that are likely to come about as a result of moving to this new model, not only to the families and the individuals, but to the organizations that are potentially being impacted by this shift in where they're going. So again, that is a question that I would say is absolutely one that should be directed towards your contacts at Human Services. Keep going.
All right. Would you anticipate that it will be PDD senior staff reviewing RFP responses, or would they add people without familiarity with agencies?
Again, I cannot comment on this particular case. I can only speak to my experience where the evaluation committee typically has 3 parts to it. The procurement person who makes sure that due process is followed, so that every RFP is evaluated the same way, every criteria is weighted the same way. So typically what happens is if you have an evaluation committee of 10 people, all 10 people get all 10 responses, they evaluate them individually. Then they get back together as a group and make sure there's consistency in how they evaluate it, and then they collectively make the determination. So there's the procurement person who's there for process. There's the government department person who is there representing the needs of government. And then there is often the content specialist who may be brought in from the outside, or someone from the staff of the department who is familiar with that particular area. So if it's transportation services, they would have one individual. If it's assessment services, they would have someone who's familiar with assessment services. Because at the end of the day, you're trying to evaluate credentials and capabilities. You do want people who are knowledgeable about those particular elements that can fairly assess this organization's abilities against this organization's abilities.
For picking, if you make the requirements, is it just done on paper, or is there an interview component as well afterwards? How does that work?
That's a great question. Again, this is another thing that has frustrated me personally. There used to be shortlist presentations for the top 2 or 3 candidates. Those have disappeared as well, so the evaluations are being made based on paper responses. And so I used to, take the view that if my proposal is strong enough to get to the top 3, then I know in the shortlist presentation I can do a really good job of demonstrating my capabilities. Only one of the 12 RFPs that I've responded to in the last year, only one has actually had the top 2 vendors shortlisted. And they're actually taking, they're doing a shortlist process. All the others have been made, the decisions have been made solely based on the paper response. So this is why I stress, and I fundamentally believe it's because of the amount of work that the staff within these organizations are having to go through, even just to evaluate these responses now, and the rigor with which they must comply with the procurement process. They don't have necessarily the time to do it. Now, if at the end of the day you score, and there are 2 organizations that by the time you add up all the numbers and scores, they are so close that you cannot distinguish one, they may, and the RFPs will say, at our discretion, we may choose to invite you in for a shortlist presentation. The point being is, assume you have to convince them based on the written word, then that's the best way to go.
And this is where we get into quality, not quantity. It's not about putting the 3-ring binder together and saying, here's a list of all those testimonials that people have written over the last 42 years about how wonderful we are. Those things are nice to have, but if you cannot articulate why us within the first 10 pages, the chances of every evaluator reading those 42 pages of testimonials is slim and none. Because they will be looking for, they have their score sheet, they have their weightings, and they will be looking to say, corporate credentials, we've asked for these 4 things. If I can't find it in the body of the document and I have to go through testimonials to find it, you likely will not get scored favorably on that. The processes become very technical based on evaluation criteria, scores, lists of words that they look for, lists of things. So when they say corporate credentials and 20%, they go, we expect to see the following certain things identified in their response. There's 2 ways of doing it. Some say we give everybody 20 points out of 20 to start with, and every one that you miss, you drop a point. Others, you start from 0 and you get a point. Every procurement agent, every procurement officer is different in terms of how they do it. I've never actually, nor do I ever want to, sit through a review of RFPs. Suffice it to say, when you get the RFPs, when you get the PQRs, look at the words that they are using. If it says service A, in your thing say, we provide service A, and here's the examples. The more you can use their words in your response so that it is easy for them to find your capabilities, the better the likelihood is that you will get credit for those types of things. This is not about flowery paragraphs. This is not about 30-page resumes or 30-page corporate profiles. This is about them being able to find the information that they need to be able to assess whether you can do the job. And that's the best advice I can give you. It's quality, not quantity. It's all about reading very explicitly what they're asking for and making absolute sure that if they say A, you give them A. And if they say they want to see B, you show them where they can find B. Because if they can find it and it's easy to find, you don't lose the point or you get the point. And I hate to make it that technical because we're talking about quality of life for persons with developmental disabilities. At the end of the day, back to the question that was asked, the PQR process is getting on the list. Make sure you cover every one of those requirements to a T. Get on the list first and foremost. When the RFP comes out, that's when there's the opportunity to show how innovative we are, how creative we are, how we've done this in different ways. Because there will be, I'm assuming, an opportunity to showcase your capabilities given the work you've done previously and how you would deliver this service going forward. Jamie, any other questions? I've got time for a couple more here.
Yes. What is your experience regarding how an appeal would be viewed?
So my experience, and again, based on personal experience only, and I'm assuming this is an appeal of why didn't I get on the list, I've had no success with that. The procurement process is pretty rigid. That's why there's a lot of time and effort that says the mandatories are the mandatory. I delivered a proposal 1 minute late, it was precluded. I gave you the example, I had one name of my EA that wasn't listed, I was precluded. This was a $500,000 proposal for a large government client, and on the basis of not including one name, never even got looked at. The appeal process may or may not be defined. The other thing is there is a risk associated with escalating and challenging the procurement process. Only once have I done that, and in essence you largely get, blacklisted is probably too strong a word, but you get a reputation that any proposal you put in for the next, pick a window of time, you are now scrutinized, and they will look for the technical misses, where they may overlook it in the little typo in the first one, they may preclude you in the next one. Suffice it to say, I've had little or no success, nor do I recommend, appealing a procurement process if it's been very well defined and it tells you what you must do.
if you don't follow it, you really don't have a leg to stand on.
My experience has been there is no appeal. It just isn't any.
You can absolutely ask for a one-on-one with the procurement person. You can ask for a one-on-one with the assistant deputy minister. You can ask for a one-on-one with the minister. All you're doing is ticking off the people who put the RFP together and earning yourself the reputation that you probably don't want to have. And I have no knowledge of any appeal, if you call it that has been successful. So, to me, don't think of it in the context that if I don't get it, I'm going to go over somebody's head. Forget it. It doesn't work. It doesn't buy you anything. Okay. Any others? Are we pretty much?
That's good. I think we'll call it there.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time this afternoon. I hope this has been helpful, informative, probably a little unsettling, disconcerting, but all I can do is to try and give you some insight as to what may be coming so that you can be as well prepared as possible for the changes that I'm seeing Human Services is looking at putting into place. And with that, we're right on 3 o'clock, so thank you again.